Hello, happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to the second of these episodes I'm doing of one rant, one deep dive, and one new study. So today, I'm excited for this one. I've been waiting for this all week. So the plan is to have these out every Friday morning, just so you know. So you'll have these in your inbox every Friday morning at 8:30. And this week, the rant's going to be about supplement misinformation, which I could talk for hours about, but I'm going to keep it to a couple of minutes. Then my deep dive is going to be on the physiology of different distances of endurance exercise. So particularly I'm going to compare the 5 kilometer to the marathon. So what's the difference in your physiology? What's the real difference between running a 5K and running a marathon? We know one's longer than the other, but what's the difference when it comes to things like your use of fats and carbohydrates, your oxygen consumption, all these other factors? And then with sport for choice with studies this week, and I was really torn between the ultra processed food study I've discussed about recently and then a study I just came across today that looked at a new technology that I don't know when it's going to be coming to market, but hopefully quite soon. That is going to be tracking 3 stress hormones essentially live, which I think is just incredible. But I'm going to talk about that one next week. And so this week I'm going to talk about the ultra processed food study that was done out of UCL. So to start off with my rant, and yeah, the general topic is going to be supplement misinformation. And I talk a lot, obviously, on my channel, particularly on Instagram and TikTok, about supplements. And I will often say most supplements don't work. It's because they don't. But more and more I'm getting things sent to me. I really appreciate when people send me things to sort of look over and talk about. So I appreciate when people do that. And I'm getting a lot come from really big accounts that are sharing some horrific information about supplements and just, I think, marketing it in a really callous way. And I think one thing I'm going to talk about a lot more on my channel in the next few weeks is what to spot when it comes to people that are marketing supplements dishonestly. And this is before we even get to the idea that, you know, not all research is created equal, and the fact that things like mushroom cordyceps do have research to quote unquote support them, but it doesn't mean that mushroom cordyceps work. But even before we get to evidence, the things that are being sent are essentially people sort of, well, almost evangelistically swearing by certain supplements. And it's the quote I always look out for, which is the biggest red flag, is the "it works for me" type one. And the reason for this is, and it's not to tell people to not take certain things, but the vast majority of supplements, even if they do have evidence that they work, you're not going to notice them working. Not unless you're very, very attuned to your own physiology, your own endurance. And there are exceptions to that, and the obvious one is caffeine. You can normally feel if you've had your caffeine in the morning. But even that, I do wonder how many times, if someone gave me a decaf in the morning, would I notice? I don't know. I wonder how much that's placebo. But even, and that's, so my point is, even with something like caffeine that has this real strong physiological effect, you're probably going to feel it, but maybe not. And so the really well evidenced supplements, things like creatine, you know, a bodybuilder that's really dialed into their strength, or a powerlifter, yeah, they probably will notice a difference in creatine, but your everyday lifter probably won't notice a difference. And it doesn't mean it's not working. It is, and they'll notice they get stronger, but how much of that is the creatine? You don't know. And so a big red flag is always, for me, someone saying, well, take my mushroom cordyceps, take my, God, what has there been this week? There's been so many things, too many to remember, but take this because I found it really works. I feel X, Y, Z. And that's always something for me that is just a huge red flag. And it all comes down to critical thinking, I think. And because of my PhD being in the sort of ketogenic diet space, I see a lot of people that seem to have incredible critical thinking skills in certain topics and then leave them at the door for other things. And one thing I find really frustrating in science is people that are predictable. You know, this is where I was worried when I started my PhD on a ketogenic diet that people were going to typecast me as a keto guy. Some people still do, I think. But you see now the sort of keto world, and it's also anti-vegetable oil, or seed oils as they call them, more and more anti-vegetables in total, anti-sun cream sometimes. But you see all these different things come up, and it's just so predictable. And there is an underlying cause, which I think is like it's an anti-establishment, like underlying to these kind of diets. And that's where you have a bit of a horseshoe theory when it comes to diet and nutrition, where you have theoretically different ends of the spectrum. You've got your ketogenic diets and your vegan diets, which actually aren't, I mean, you can do a vegan ketogenic diet, they don't have to be opposite ends of the spectrum, but you have these theoretical extremes. Now, they shouldn't have to be extreme at all, but they're seen as extremes online. And again, that's social media for you. But they have, I think, a common friend, which is the kind of anti-establishment, anti-big pharma, anti-big corporation underlying, which, is an interesting one. But then you see some of the books that I've read. Every keto book under the sun. Did it when I was starting my PhD to try and immerse myself in that world. And you see some really good critiques of funding of research and sort of state sponsor within these sorts of things, which is completely valid. But then you see them being completely oblivious to that in other contexts, and that is frustrating. But I think it's important when you reflect on using critical thinking, or when we all use critical thinking, that it's important to question things that you disagree with as well as the things you agree with. And I'm really conscious of trying to make sure I read things I disagree with, change my mind on things if I need to, not getting too hung up in my, what do I think of something, what are my views, and not getting bogged down with being labeled in a certain way, because evidence can change, and that's the beauty of science. Nothing's ever proven. We have hypotheses, and we continue to work to the best of our knowledge within those hypotheses until things change. And even things, maybe there's going to be research that shows mushroom cordyceps do improve endurance, capacity, and efficiency, and I'll happily change my mind. But I mean, it's unlikely, but that's always a possibility. And I think I think I see too much online of people just not having an open mind, I suppose. You see the same actually in the keto world. Suddenly, obviously, all the talk is about Ozempic, Wegovy, etc., weight loss jabs, and I could have told you before that the keto lot will come out and dislike it, and so they find their reasons and they come out and they tend to be, or at least the tribal aspect of it is anti weight loss jabs. And again, it comes really from the same reason, in the sense that firstly, they believe in the ability of a ketogenic diet to lose weight, but also that anti-establishment type rhetoric. But yeah, bit of a long rant for today, but it's one that I've been thinking a lot about, kind of that mixture of critical thinking and particularly around supplements and misinformation. It's one that I want to try and get straight to really push more on social media, because I think understanding what is good communication and good science communication, because there are some companies that I think do fantastic science communication, and they probably don't get appreciated enough. And the problem is there are more companies that do dreadful science communication to sell their products. Not naming any names, but I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. But the deep dive today, so I've rambled on a little bit longer than I hoped for there. But if you're still with me, the deep dive is looking at the physiological differences between a 5-kilometer run and a marathon. And the reason I love talking about this is that we have these three energy systems. Our ATP-PC system, which is this explosive system that lasts about 12 seconds. You've got your glycolytic system, or your anaerobic glycolysis system, which is how we're breaking down carbohydrate without the use of oxygen. Tends to be predominantly short, sharp work as well, up to, say, 2 minutes worth. And then above that, we're predominantly aerobic, so we're using our oxidative system. And so because of that, the 5-kilometer run and the marathon are both using that same general energy system, the aerobic system, predominantly. And this is one of the reasons that even though a 5-kilometer run for a top athlete might take 15 minutes or so, and a marathon might take just over 2 hours, so very different in length, but a fantastic or an elite 5K runner may also be an elite marathon runner, even though they're very different in length. It's because they use that same energy system. But that doesn't mean there aren't differences between them. And so the big difference is the fractional utilization of your VO2 max. And so what that means is, what is a percentage of your max you're able to work at? And so your average individual might work at 65% of their VO2 max for a marathon. Eliud Kipchoge, the greatest marathon runners of all time, will work at 97, 98% of his max, maybe 95% for a marathon. So they're able to work at very high fractional utilizations. But if we look at just your average individual, they can obviously maintain a higher percent of the VO2 max for a 5K because it's a shorter event. And over a marathon, that's going to drop down. And so what does that mean? So if you're working at, say, 80% of your VO2 max for a 5-kilometer run, so if your VO2 max is 50, you're working at 40, so 40 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. Whereas during a marathon, you're working at, say, what would that be, 32 or so. So what does that mean in practice? Well, the higher percentage of VO2 max you're working at, the more carbohydrate you're burning and the less fat you'll be burning. And so that means a 5-kilometer run is very glycolytic. You're burning a lot of carbohydrate and not much fat because you're working at that higher exercise intensity. Whereas over a marathon, if you're working at 65% VO2 max, you're likely burning more fat. And that normally culminates in a mixed metabolism where you're burning, say, 50% carb, 50% fat, but there's a huge amount of individual variation there. So they're the key differences, really. But what's interesting then is when you compare what are the difference between an elite athlete and a non-elite athlete. And something I talk about a lot is the concept of what applies to an elite athlete might not apply to a sub-elite athlete. And that's the best example because, like I just said, Eliud Kipchoge is able to run a marathon at, say, 95% of his VO2 max, whereas most people run at, say, 65%. And that means a lot of things. That means Eliud Kipchoge is burning a lot more carbohydrate, firstly, just because of that higher fractional utilization, but also because of the differences in speed. His calories per hour, so just the number of sheer calories he's burning, is really high as well. And so I'm seeing a lot of fueling data come out from elite athletes, and we're seeing these huge carbohydrate numbers. But that doesn't mean it applies to non-elite athletes because that underlying physiology is very different. Particularly, firstly, the overall calorie burning per hour is less. And secondly, because your fractional utilization is lower, you're working at a lower percentage of your VO2 max, you're going to be burning more fat and less carbohydrate. And so on both of these fronts, the carbohydrate requirements are going to be lower. But on top of that, again, elite athletes can oxidize more carbohydrate. And so you have these three different things that mean that elite athletes may well benefit from these high carbohydrate numbers, but that doesn't mean it necessarily applies to sub-elite athletes. And I'm pretty convinced by the current data that it doesn't apply. And that's where we have data that shows actually consuming more than 90 grams an hour in non-elite athletes has impaired performance. And that's only in a single study by Andy King from Leeds Beckett University. But it makes sense because it came along with that increased glycogen utilization. When you consume more carbohydrate than your body can absorb from the intestines into the bloodstream, then you actually increase your use of muscle glycogen, so the carbohydrate you store in the muscle. And so it's a really interesting area. But I think one of the things that's important to understand is that difference between your elite athlete and your sub-elite athlete, as well as the differences in these different events. And finally, the study that I really enjoyed looking at this week was a study on ultra-processed foods. It was led by a guy called Sam Dicken from UCL, with a big team behind them. And it was an amazing study. And I know there was some confusion, at least on my TikTok, about the methodology of the study. And so I can hopefully use this time to clarify it. But to sort of outline their findings first, they wanted to look at, firstly, a longer intervention on ultra-processed foods compared to minimally processed foods. And then within that intervention, though, they wanted to make sure both groups were following the traditional eat well plate dietary guidelines. We've seen data before by guys like Kevin Hall who find that when people eat ultra processed foods, they overconsume calories, and it gives a mechanism as to why people spontaneously overconsume calories when they're consuming ultra processed foods. But one of the questions that this research paper sought to answer was, what happens if we do provide ultra processed foods, but they're still following the Eat Well plate or the sort of dietary guidelines for the United Kingdom? And the fascinating finding, before we get onto the minimally processed food as well, but the fascinating finding was that these individuals in a free living situation, when told to eat ad libitum, so eat to hunger, actually they lost weight and they were consuming less calories than they were expending, even though their diet was consisting of ultra processed foods. And the mechanism there, or this reported mechanism, which makes complete sense to me, is that it's because they were being given ultra processed foods, but still following dietary guidelines. And so they weren't chowing down their Crunchy Rocks or their Milky Way bars or whatever it might be. They were still eating to the Eat Well plate, but in an ultra processed way. Now, when you bring in the minimally processed group did the same, but obviously with minimally processed foods, and also lost weight, but lost more weight. And again, makes perfect sense, but it's really interesting to put that into, I guess, perspective. And what this does to me is it puts a bit of a caveat in the idea of ultra processed food equals bad, because of course we see that minimally processed food has outperformed ultra processed food, and that's expected. And just to give you some examples of what they provide on each diet, the minimally processed food, some examples they gave were ingredients for homemade spaghetti bolognese, oats to have porridge and things like that. Whereas in the ultra processed group, they gave examples of a lasagna ready meal. They gave an example of like oat bars, like the sort of on the go type bars you can eat, and breakfast cereals. And what I find really interesting about this study and what they did within the methods is they provided them with 4,000 calories a day worth of food, and then told them to eat ad libitum, so to not restrict their food. And some people have, I guess, got a bit confused by that, and actually I think it's a really real big strength of the study. And the idea is that they wanted to recreate free living conditions. And so all of us now probably have spare food in our fridge, in our cupboards. We have extra food, but we're not eating it necessarily because we're eating generally to hunger. And so they wanted to recreate that. So when they provided them 4,000 calories, it wasn't saying, here you go, eat 4,000 calories. It was providing them with up to 4,000 calories for them to then not eat anything else that wasn't provided for them. And what they found was, of course, the minimally processed food lost more weight. But the ultra processed group did still lose weight. And I think it's an important consideration because firstly, there are some people that will eat ultra processed foods for a variety of reasons, but an obvious one is convenience. People don't have much time on their hands, and they are going to eat a ready meal. They're going to have an oat bar that's much more convenient, or you waste less time, etc. Then you can still do that and lose weight if you're adhering to dietary guidelines. So that is definitely a takeaway. And of course, you don't want to then come out and say, oh, ultra processed food is fine because it was outperformed by minimally processed food. Then it was all about context. But it was a really fantastic study. But what they also looked at, and I haven't looked at the lipid markers too much yet, but they also showed that lipid markers improved in both groups, and that makes sense in the fact that both groups lost weight. But there were some interesting findings. So triglycerides reduced more in the minimally processed group, whereas LDL reduced more in the ultra processed group. And I'm going to dig into the methods a bit more to see if there's sort of any methods that can explain that, because that's an interesting finding. And something that I'd like to look into a bit more. The final one was hedonic appetite, so essentially food cravings. And one thing I think is particularly, this was a fairly long-term study, but food cravings I think are going to play a big role in long-term weight loss, and food cravings were significantly lower in the ultra-processed group, so hedonic appetite was significantly lower. And that's also a really important finding for people that crave foods or say suffer from. Not suffering, well, probably not the best wording, but people that experience food cravings, that's a better way of putting it, is that switching out ultra processed foods to minimally processed foods seems to have a positive impact on food cravings, and that's a really interesting finding. And again, the mechanism there is something I'd love to dig into more, whether there are differences in the macronutrients, whether that be fiber, whether that be sugar, or whether it be to do with flavors. It's a really interesting one. But I thought that was a phenomenal study. My God, how much time and effort that would have taken, I dread to think. But a really good one. And that is today's episode. It's a little bit longer than last week, so if you're still with me, thank you very much for listening. If you are still with me, then I'd love you to comment and just let me know that you're still here, because like I say, I'm experimenting with this just to see if people like this format, like listen to me sort of ramble in longer form. I've done a couple of podcasts recently, so if you do want to listen to me in longer form, do go and check those out. You can probably tell that despite the fact that my videos are normally 90 seconds long, I really enjoy longer form conversation. If you enjoy this, you'd like to see any more of it, please let me know. Be nice to have a reason to keep doing these, because it's probably my favorite type of video to do. But you also all might have gone because I've been rambling for a lot longer than last week. So thank you for listening. If you've got any topic ideas you'd like me to cover next week, then please drop them in the comments as well. And I will see you next week.